change for the disaster? Well, let us bring in Michael Mann, a climate scientist and director of the Earth System Science Centre. That's in Penn State University. You're very welcome to The Context. Can we know whether these floods are directly related to climate change? I know President Ramaphosa has said they are.
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be with you. And this is a tragedy, and it is a tragedy that has been made worse by climate change. So what we can say is that these sorts of events are more extreme than they would have been without the human-caused warming of the planet. And at some point, it's really basic physics. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture. So when you do get rainfall, you get more of it in shorter periods of time. And that's what we're seeing here. Unprecedented flooding, about 2 centimeters of rain fell per hour for a 24-hour period. This is the sort of event that is becoming much more widespread. We see it in the United States, we see it in Europe, we see it here in Africa.
So Cyril Ramaphosa, I think, calling it climate change, it was really interesting. Do you feel there's a commitment by his government to try and tackle it, or maybe adapt? I suppose that's one of the words that we often use now when we talk about dealing with climate change.
Yeah, you know, we do have to invest in resilience. We have to help, people adapt to those changes that are now inevitable. A certain amount of climate damage is now baked in, and we're going to see more of these sorts of extreme weather events, these sorts of extreme floods now, no matter what we do, but we need to prevent it from getting worse. That requires mitigation. That requires us getting off fossil fuels as quickly as we can. In South Africa, and many other countries need to do more than they're currently doing, because adaptation alone is not going to be adequate to keep us insulated from the increasingly damaging impacts of climate change.
So what would it be? I mean, South Africa often actually, suffers with power cuts, energy failures, for example. I suppose they're dealing with a lot of issues. Who is it up to try and, change their reliance on fossil fuels, for example? What path would you map out for them?
Yeah, so they need to invest in clean energy infrastructure, and it's a win-win sort of path forward. A more robust energy system that is more resilient and not subject to the sorts of fluctuations that we see with a fossil fuel-driven grid. So sort of microgrids, renewable energy, wind, solar, geothermal-driven energy, that is the path that we need to follow around the world, and of course, including Africa. It's a path to greater prosperity and to keeping a livable, planet, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, some, Michael, might find it unfair in some ways that so many across Africa actually have pretty low emissions, but are suffering so much because of emissions in other parts of the world. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There are large parts of Africa with a fairly low standard of living, very low usage of energy. These are people who are, in fact, most prone to the damaging impacts of climate change. They've got the least wealth, they've got the least resilience, and so they are most impacted by these increasingly extreme weather events, and yet they did the least to create this problem in the first place. It's the Western world, the United States, Europe, and other industrial countries who have created this problem, and it's on us to lead in decarbonizing the world economy and to providing assistance, for example, to countries like Africa that need to cope with the impacts that they're already dealing with and don't have the infrastructure and the resilience that we have in the Western world.
So like the continent across Africa, South Africa, which we're speaking about specifically. Ron, let me turn to you on this. I think I'm really going back to the war in Ukraine in a way as well, because of course we're seeing high energy prices as well, in some ways sometimes tied to the conflict. We saw E15 ethanol, a blend being allowed in the United States to bring down gas prices, something that people feel is not as clean as it should be for a source of fuel. Do you think climate change has been kind of put on the back burner with all the world events that are taking place?
I do, Nuala. I think here in the United States that Americans are so focused on inflation and the impact of inflation and the fact that wages have not risen to really compete with the level of inflation here in the United States. So we do have wage growth, but it's not enough to counterbalance, to counteract the impact of inflation that we haven't seen in the United States since 1981. Heading into the election, I think inflation and crime and what's going on in Ukraine are a lot of the issues that are bringing President Biden's poll numbers down. I do think that climate is something important for the United States and our allies to focus on, but it is certainly not something that I think is top of mind. But when we talk about climate, when we talk about getting to zero carbon or reducing carbon emissions, one thing I think that's left out of the conversation, Nuala, is the fact that the Chinese and the Indians still are burning, they're emitting, they're doing so much. And we talk about Western Europe and the United States, but we also need to look at our friends around the world and say they need to step up as well.
It's interesting, and I will throw that back to Michael in a moment, but Caroline, first to you, because COP26, I mean, it was in Glasgow like less than a year ago. Do you feel that in any way, I don't know, put down proper roots for people dealing with climate change in a different way, or instead, I don't know, that it somehow has been forgotten in some respects?
Well, I mean, in some respects, it's not surprising given everything else that's going on, and Ron highlighted some of the issues in the US, similarly happening here, you know, energy prices going up, cost of living going up, and obviously we're still coming out of a pandemic, so let's not forget that. But I think what's encouraging here in the UK is that actually I think that the shift that has happened in terms of the majority of the public from all sorts of backgrounds, working class, middle class, you know, you name it, different communities, there has been a greater understanding about climate change and how it is affecting us. And of course, we've experienced here in the UK floods as well. We've seen these short episodes of violent extreme weather. So I think that's good. One of the issues, of course, that's come out of what's happening in Ukraine is energy security and not being reliant on fossil fuels. So out of that, I think can come a broader message about the need to make these changes to a more low carbon way of living. But important in the earlier article is to recognise there's countries around the world, South Africa, across Africa, who are the ones who aren't the bad guys in this in terms of the emissions, and they need our help to make the transition as well.
Yeah, and let me turn back to you, Michael, just before I let you go briefly. Ron brought up China and India. How would you rate, I suppose, their progress at this time following COP26 almost a year ago?
Yeah, I'd like to make 2 points, actually. The first point is that, you know, what we're seeing right now, Russia's aggression, their war on Ukraine, is a product of our historical reliance on fossil fuels. We have propped up authoritarian dictatorships like Russia, petrostates, because of our reliance on their oil and gas. And Russia is using that right now as a cudgel to prevent Europe from taking greater sanctions against them. So if anything emphasizes the dangers of our continued reliance on fossil fuels, aside from the climate crisis, it's what we're seeing play out right now in Ukraine. The other point I would make is that China, under the Obama administration, there was a bilateral agreement between China and the US, and China ended up exceeding their commitments under that agreement, and they were exceeding their commitments under Paris. Then Donald Trump came in, said he was withdrawing from the Paris Accord, and China and India and a whole bunch of other countries actually backed off in their commitments. And so what that tells us is that as the world's largest cumulative emitter of carbon pollution, the United States has put more carbon pollution into the atmosphere than any other country. We need to lead on this issue. And when we do lead on this issue, then these other countries do come to the table.
You know, we won't get into it yet, Michael, but the China-Russia connection, but that's a story for another day. Thank you so much for joining us here on The Context, Michael.